This is Patricia Jurewicz from Responsible Sourcing Network, and I'm very excited to be presenting our webinar today. We have several wonderful speakers joining us, and I will introduce all of them in a moment. You can send questions during the presentations. We're actually going to be doing Q&A after each section, and you are all currently in listen-only mode. We do have handouts for the presentation, which you may be able to see on the dashboard. If not, we'll send those out afterwards. And with that, let's go ahead and go to the presenter slide. So along with myself, we have Kirill Boychenko from the Cotton Campaign, who's been the coordinator there for the last few years. Allison Gill, who's the Research and Policy Advisor for Uzbek-German Forum for Human Rights, and Ruslan Mayetev, the editor of Alternative Turkmen News. Our agenda today does have a slight change to it. Next slide, please. And that is that we will be hearing from Ruslan first to discuss the cotton harvest observations in Turkmenistan, and then we'll go to Uzbekistan and ILO engagement. So we're going to have to forward through some of the slides to our Turkmen session. You can go ahead and do that, Kirill. And then I will turn the microphone over to Ruslan. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Ruslan Mayetev. I'm the editor of Alternative Turkmenistan News. It's an independent media and human rights initiative based in the Netherlands. With a team of dedicated and trained reporters, every fall we monitor the use of forced labor in Turkmenistan during the cotton picking season. And let me start with the fact that in Turkmenistan, picking cotton is mandatory for all public sector workers, or in other words, for all those who get paid by the state. It's teachers, doctors, staff of various regional departments, banks, factories, transport agencies, post offices, municipal and social services. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of the scope of the problem, please take a look at this slide. From late August until mid-December, nearly 46,000 teachers alone pick cotton every day. We came to this figure by multiplying the total number of schools in all the cotton growing regions in Turkmenistan with an average number of teachers taken to the fields from each school. And this is only teachers. As I said, picking cotton is mandatory for doctors and other public sector workers. When the harvest season starts, life in the country virtually pauses. Hospital patients face shortages of doctors, and in schools, classes are often being cancelled because teachers pick cotton. The daily quota for people is 50 kilograms. That's about 110 pounds. Civil servants take daily, weekly, and monthly shifts, and the most vulnerable segment of society is street cleaners, mailmen, and others. They often stay in the cotton fields for up to 1 month, often sleeping in the open air and securing their own food and drinks. The pick or pay practice creates massive corruption. In Turkmenistan, the authorities allow and in fact encourage people to pay money to hire a replacement worker if they don't want to pick cotton themselves. The daily fee is around $2, but this practice, the pick or pay practice, fosters corruption among government officials. For example, a school principal collects $2 each from 50 teachers, but in fact hires only 10 replacement workers and pays them only $20. The remaining $80 is then split between himself and his supervisors at the Department of Education. And these amounts may sound small, but we are talking about just the daily income of one school principal. Imagine that the harvesting season lasts for about 110 days. So just one school principal can make up to $9,000 in a season. For Turkmenistan, that's a lot of money. And those who refuse both to pick and to pay are threatened with termination of employment, salary cuts, and other penalties. Officially, people are sacked for any other reason but refusal to pick cotton, thus making it impossible to restore their labor rights. Next slide, please. Here we can see civil servants at collection points early in the morning. Next. We see buses bringing people to the cotton fields in the evening. They come to pick them up again and bring back to the cities. It's not always the buses that take people to cotton fields. Very often it happens that people have to board trucks and to travel to the cotton fields for hours. And as I said before, forced laborers secure their own drinking water, food, and other supplies like medicines, for instance. Next slide, please. Here I would like to show you the income statement of an average farmer. For farmers in Turkmenistan, growing cotton is also a form of forced labor. Let me explain this. All arable lands in Turkmenistan belong to the state. Farmers only lease the land to grow what the state dictates, cotton or wheat. The state has the monopoly in providing mechanical services, cotton seeds and fertilizers, not to mention that farmers are allowed to sell the cotton only to the state. And this slide demonstrates the income of an average farmer. Here you can see the farmer's cotton yield and how much money he can earn by selling it to the state. The lines in the expenses section show the fees that the farmer pays for all the services that he received. At the bottom, you can see his net profit, $323. And this is his yearly income. However, this entire cotton income statement is positive. It means that the farmer's cotton yield was fine, but it often happens that due to the low quality of seeds or bad weather conditions like floods, the crop is very low. In such cases, at the end of the year, it turns out that the farmer even owes money to the state for the services provided. And of course, nobody forces people to lease lands and grow cotton, but when the unemployment rate is so high, up to 60%, there is not really a lot of choice. Next slide, please. Forced labor monitoring in Turkmenistan hurts the government. In 2016 and 2017, our reporters found no, that's a different slide, sorry. In 2016, all of the advocacy work and all of the forced labor reporting basically forced big Western companies to ban cotton from Turkmenistan or ban textiles from Turkmenistan. In 2016, it was H&M. Inditex and the VFC also confirmed they stopped working with Turkmenistan in 2016. And last year in July, big European brand IKEA also publicly announced that because of forced labor, they are stopping sourcing from Turkmenistan. Next slide, please. In 2016 and 17, our reporters in the country found tons of Levi's, Zara, Bershka, Pull&Bear, Montana, Marc Ecko, US Polo, and other brands sold in Turkmenistan straight from wheelbarrows next to piles of carrots and beets. All of the jeans are labeled made in Turkmenistan. All of them cost $3 or less. It is clear that the jeans were made for export, but for some reason they ended up in Turkmen bazaars at a very cheap price. This could be an indication that some of the new brands had unofficially refused to buy from Turkmenistan due to its forced labor practices. Next, please. This is one of the images from the bazaars. Next. Now I would like to focus on this person. as I said, of course, my organization's activity and the advocacy work of our partners in the cotton campaign hurt the government. Our forced labor reports continue to come out based on which companies and Western governments draw their conclusions and act accordingly by banning Turkmen cotton or textiles, or by placing it in the lowest category for human trafficking. However, instead of learning lessons from it and improving the situation with forced labor, the government strengthens control and tries to silence activists. In October 2016, one of our field monitors was arrested just 2 days after my organization published his extensive report on forced labor and child labor. When the police came after him at midnight, they said it was related to the internet and photos. And prior to his arrest, he reported about civil servants being forced to pick cotton. He interviewed teenagers on why they miss schools and sell themselves as replacement workers. In the police, Gaspar Matalaev was tortured with electric shocks to confess to false charges of bribery and fraud. A month later, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. And despite many international calls for his release, he is still in custody. Next slide, please. This was the extensive report of Gaspar, which I mentioned. It's titled, "They Bring People to Cotton Fields in the Back of a Truck Like Sheep for Sale." The day he was arrested, Turkmenistan's Minister of National Security was severely reprimanded by the president for weak control over subordinates in the country. That's an official reason. I would like to end the presentation here on this not very pleasant note and reiterate once again that forced labor exists in Turkmenistan in its ugliest forms, that it fosters corruption among state officials, and that the government doesn't seem to be willing to improve the situation. On the contrary, it uses force, tortures, and imprisonment to silence activists who dare to uncover forced labor in Turkmenistan. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
All right, thank you so much, Ruslan. This is Patricia, and in the questions section, you can go ahead and enter your questions there. I'm also going to double check and see if I can unmute all of the attendees. I believe people are unmuted, or you could try raising your hand if you'd like to. But I do have one question, Ruslan, and that is similar to Uzbekistan. Has the situation in Turkmenistan been going on for decades like that, or if you could point out any differences that you're aware of in Turkmenistan versus Uzbekistan regarding forced labor?
It has always been like that in Turkmenistan. Both countries, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, were part of the Soviet Union, and since the early years of the Soviet Union, the two countries have grown cotton. Basically, it was one of the main crops for the two countries. The situation with forced labor is not very much different. The system operates almost identically. As I said, just like in Uzbekistan, in Turkmenistan, the state controls and directs the entire cotton industry, from growing cotton to processing it, producing garments, and selling it to clients, including the clients overseas. The state has the monopoly on everything, on land, on mechanical support, etc. It's a very similar situation like in Uzbekistan. However, the difference until recently was that in 2008, Turkmenistan legally banned the use of child labor in cotton fields, while the practice was still existent in Uzbekistan. However, last year when we did the monitoring, we found out that this law, was basically broken by officials in some of the regions because of the quota system, and because some of the regions were late to fulfill the quota. They massively organized children. They canceled schools. They said, okay, for the coming week there won't be classes, there won't be schools, and you will have to go to pick cotton. So it really depends from year to year, but the general situation with forced labor and with cotton industry is very much alike.
Great, thank you. And I see that Elliot. Oops.
Yeah, hi Ruslan, my name is Elliot. Thank you for your presentation. I just had one quick question. Could you please repeat your points on how sometimes farmers become indentured to the state, sometimes owing them money through this practice?
Yes, absolutely. Kirill, can you go please to the income statement slide? It's one of the, yes, this one. No, next, yeah. As I said, the state provides mechanical services. The state provides chemicals, fertilizers.
So great. Hello, Ruslan. Can you still hear me? Ruslan, are you there? You know, I was trying to mute everyone, and I think I maybe accidentally muted Ruslan, but I thought he should still be able to talk. Kirill, are you there? Can you speak? All right, no Kirill either. So we are having a short technical difficulty. I apologize for the situation. Let me see if I can bring everybody back. Could anybody try unmuting and speaking just to see where we are at? All right, sorry about that, Ruslan. Let me see if I can't pull you up here and unmute you. Ruslan, could you try raising your hand, because I'm not seeing your name in the here we go, attendee list. Here we go. All right, sorry about that, Ruslan. Are you back?
Yes,
okay,
I'm back.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
That's okay. I don't know what was the last part that everybody heard, but the state in Turkmenistan provides all of the services to farmers. And if it turns out that the seeds were bad, that the weather was bad, that there was, let's say, little water this season, or I don't know, any other things that affect the crop, and if the crop was small, then the farmer owes money to the state, because to pay for all of the services like seeds and irrigation and fertilizers and defoliation, etc., farmers farmers receive credits. They receive basically money from banks, from a farmer's bank. It's called just like that, farmer's bank. They receive money at the beginning of the year, and to cover all of the expenses, they pay from that money. At the end of the year, when the state pays the farmer, the real calculation starts, mathematics. They take off the money that he paid for the services, and the remaining amount, if there is anything if there is anything remained, then that makes it the farmer's income.
Great. Okay, I think we'll have to move on. If we have time at the end for additional questions, then we'll go ahead and bring you back in and have you be available for other questions. I'm now going to turn it over to Kirill Boychenko, the coordinator of the Cotton Campaign. And I'm not sure, I think Allison's been having some difficulty joining us, but hopefully she is with us. Go ahead, Kirill.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I believe that Allison is on the call with us. I think that she just joined us with her cell phone. Allison, can you try speaking to us, please?
I do see an Allison Gingo. I don't know. Oh, maybe it has to be. The problem is I might have to unmute her, and I'm not seeing her name in the attendee list if she just called in.
Can you see a telephone number that ends?
Actually, Kirill, why don't you get started? And I was going to say I can try to conference Allison in.
Okay, I'm happy to get started, but if you can see phone numbers, then you might be able to identify Allison.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't.
Okay.
So why don't you go ahead?
Sure, absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Kirill Boychenko. Thank you so much for your interest and joining today's webinar. I wanted to provide you some information on Uzbekistan and cotton campaign. So as most of you know, we've been working to end forced labor in the cotton fields of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan for now 10 years. We are marking a decade of our advocacy this year. So it's been a long, challenging, but also hopeful road for us. We have some changes on the ground in Uzbekistan. We also have continuous monitoring and reporting from Turkmenistan, thanks to Alternative Turkmenistan News and work of Ruslan Mitiev, whom you heard at the beginning. I wanted to first bring your attention to the recent ILO third-party monitoring report of 2017. It came out in February this year. It's a recent report by the ILO submitted to the World Bank, and it shows the limitations in methodology, but also it finds forced labor, coercion, and extortion of Uzbek citizens during Uzbekistan's 2017 cotton harvest. Here are some of the ILO findings from the last harvest in Uzbekistan. The ILO found that a certain number picked cotton during at least some part of the harvest as a result of persuasion, pressure, or coercion, and that social pressure and intimidation to pick cotton is still widespread across the country. The ILO estimate based on the poll consisted of over 800 randomly sampled phone interviews of general population, concluded that 13% or 336,000 from overall 2.6 million people who pick cotton participated in voluntary and under menace of penalty. This is the same as forced. And this is important to highlight once again that even despite the limitations in methodology, which I will touch upon a bit later, and even with over 800, only 800 sample phone interviews, the ILO found that the forced labor is pervasive and systematic still in the cotton sector of Uzbekistan. The ILO report shows the limitations of their approach to monitoring because they exclude mentioning or monitoring the key drivers of forced labor, such as the mandatory quota system and the fact that the amount of voluntary labor drops as less cotton is available to pick. We are working closely with the Uzbek-German Forum for Human Rights. This organization monitors labor and human rights in Uzbekistan and is relying on a network of local activists across the country. And according to UGF findings, the Uzbek government did not change the structural root causes, and forced labor continues to be widespread and systematic in Uzbekistan. The ILO, as you know, is a tripartite United Nations agency representing governments, employers, and workers. On many occasions, the ILO stressed the importance in understanding its mandate, which is based on a 2-1-1 formula, which means that each country represented by 2 government delegates, 1 delegate representing employers, and 1 workers. In Uzbekistan, all 4 are represented by the government in practice, with 2 government-controlled organizations, the Federation of Trade Unions of Uzbekistan and the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Uzbekistan. According to its governance structure, in 2017, as in preceding years, the ILO monitoring team included a national counterpart, namely Federation of Trade Unions of Uzbekistan, to ensure that the ILO expert can get immediate and unrestricted access to educational and medical institutions, local authorities, and other locations, including cotton fields. And even though FTU representatives did not participate in the interview as in the previous years, it's still a social partner that is unfortunately not representative of workers or democratic, and found to be complicit in forcible mobilization of Uzbek citizens to pick cotton. Here on this slide are some of the findings from the recent ILO report. We published our own report analyzing independence of Federation of Trade Unions of Uzbekistan and their participation in the annual cotton harvest. Unfortunately, but forced labor, extortion, and other abusive practices remain pervasive in the 2017 cotton harvest in Uzbekistan. UGF monitors conducted research in 7 regions, including in the 3 districts of South Karakalpakstan, where the World Bank South Karakalpakstan Water Resources Management Improvement Project is being implemented. And in each region, monitors have visited numerous sites, including mobilization sites, schools, colleges, universities, hospitals, clinics, local government agencies, markets, private firms, cotton fields, and worker housing. Additionally, it's worthwhile noting that UGF, the frontline non-governmental organization who has local monitors on the ground in Uzbekistan, is the only organization that conducts monitoring during the spring field work or cotton weeding season in Uzbekistan. The ILO does not monitor forced labor and child labor or the impact of measures to reduce the risk of forced and child labor in spring field work. And according to UGF findings, public sector workers, including health and education workers, were forced to weed cotton fields and do other field work in spring 2017 for no pay and under threat of penalty, usually dismissal. There were some important changes on the ground that I mentioned at the beginning. On September 21st, the Uzbek government recalled hundreds of thousands of forced laborers, but not all of health and education workers were returned from the fields. For those recalled, including students from at least 5 universities, it was only a short reprieve before they were remobilized for further exploitation in the cotton fields. Public sector workers, teachers, doctors, bank employees, small business owners, employers of large enterprises were ordered to pay for replacement pickers or face forced labor themselves, organized by the central government throughout 2017. And I hear that Alison joined our webinar. And Patricia, if this sounds good to you, we could pass floor to Alison and then come back to Q&A.
That sounds great. Alison, you should be unmuted now, and you could go ahead and switch over to her slides. Alison, are you there?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm sorry for the difficulty in joining you, but I'm glad to be here.
Great, we can hear you well. Go ahead.
Great. Well, Kirill gave a really thorough introduction to the situation this year. I'm just going to pick up where he left off. You know, we've been at this. The Uzbek-German Forum and the Cotton Campaign have been, as you know, advocating for change in Uzbekistan for a really long time, for 10 years now. The Uzbek-German Forum has been conducting independent monitoring of the cotton production system for at least the last 7 years. So 2017 harvest was a really important year. There were some positive developments, and I think it's important that we take stock of those and evaluate what they mean. Because there are a lot of competing narratives, and it's really important to look at the evidence and to look at the developments and make some decisions about where we go from here. So as you know, because I know you've all been following this for a long time, systematic child labor, state-sponsored systematic child labor has been phased out in Uzbekistan, which is a tremendous accomplishment and is in no small part due to the pressure from your organizations. As well as other partners. This doesn't mean we don't see child labor anymore. It just means that we don't see the system-wide, state-sponsored use of it across the country anymore. So there are isolated cases, and there are still risks of child labor, which I can talk about if you have questions about those. But that's an important development. The president acknowledged forced labor in his speech to the UN in September, as Kirill mentioned. He said that that Uzbekistan was working with the ILO and had eradicated forced labor, which is perhaps overstating it. But it was an important, very public, high-level acknowledgement of a forced labor problem. The recall that Kirill was mentioning was also very important. University students and some health and education workers were recalled from the field immediately following the president's statement at the UN, and I think perhaps even more importantly, following the president of the World Bank's conversation with Uzbek President Mirziyoyev on the margins of the UN, in which he made a personal appeal for Uzbekistan to stop forced labor. So I think that was a really important moment that shows us that pressure really does work. So 200,000 university students were recalled from the fields after only a couple of weeks and returned to classes. And our monitors and the ILO monitors say that universities mostly operated normally throughout the rest of the season with some exceptions. And that's an important development because for years, universities have essentially been closed for 2 to 3 months while students were picking cotton. Another important development was the government increased the wages paid to cotton pickers. The wage increase was large in absolute terms. It was relatively minor when you take into account inflation and other economic issues. But I'm touching on it because it was an attempt to address one of the structural causes of forced labor, which is that people aren't paid enough to want to pick cotton. So it's really the first time we've seen the government actually make a move to address one of the root causes. Much more can be done and much more needs to be done in this, but I do want to acknowledge the significance. Finally, there was a little bit of engagement with civil society activists. The government, the Deputy Minister of Labor, held 2 roundtables brokered by the ILO with some civil society activists in Tashkent. And again, this didn't have sort of immediate or sweeping impact, but it is an important signal for the first time that the government might be open to listening to independent views from activists on the ground. So that's what I would say are the positive developments of the 2017 harvest. But as Kirill mentioned, despite these developments, we found, the Uzbek-German Forum found, that forced labor remained both widespread and systematic. It was organized and directed by the central government. So you may know how the Uzbek-German Forum works. If you're interested in our methodology, how we gather information, I'm happy to answer any questions about that. I'll just very quickly say the monitors on the ground in Uzbekistan use a variety of methods, including visits to cotton fields and worker housing where they do brief interviews with people picking cotton, visits to mobilization sites where people gather to be sent to the cotton fields, monitoring of local and international media sources. They obtain, where they can, government documents that show how the system is run and organized. And then they do long-form, confidential interviews with people affected by the cotton harvest, either people forced to pick cotton, people who pick cotton voluntarily, or people who were asked to pay or extorted for money to support the cotton harvest. So this year they did, we'll have to get the exact number for you, but over 75 of these long-form interviews in 7 regions in the country, including in World Bank project areas. So through this research, we found that the central government continues to organize and direct the cotton harvest in every stage. They set the production quotas that each region must meet. They control the inputs required to produce cotton. They control the prices paid to the wages paid to workers, and they control the prices paid to farmers for cotton. They remain the monopoly buyer for cotton, so farmers who produce cotton have to sell it to the government at the government set price, which traditionally has been lower than the government's own estimated cost of production. The government issues regulations to regional governments on how cotton picking should be organized and supervised, specifying down to how cotton picking brigades are recruited, how they're paid, how they're supervised. In some government documents that we obtained this year, we have copies of these regulations that spell out the recruitment and supervision of brigades, and where the government specifies that staff from ministries of health and education, as well as law enforcement and other government agencies, are responsible for recruiting workers and supervising them in the fields. And this flies in the face of the government's commitment, its public policy commitment, not to involve health or education workers in the harvest. In fact, we have documentation that shows not only were they involved in the harvest, they were required to recruit and supervise workers in the fields. From the top then, regional officials receive quotas that they have to produce in their regions. And this is really, I think, one of the key root causes of forced labor. These officials are under direct pressure from the central government to produce cotton quotas. If they fail, they face penalties, including being dismissed. And so, as Kirill mentioned, because the amount of voluntary labor tends to fluctuate, as it tends to decline as the amount of cotton available to pick declines, the key way that regional and district officials are able to ensure that they can meet their quotas is by requiring public sector organizations to send their staff to the fields. And that's what we've seen for years, and that is what we saw this year. Local and regional governors require, under immense pressure, heads of schools, hospitals, clinics, tax authorities, business associations, public utility companies, law enforcement agencies, and other publicly funded institutions to send their employees to the fields. This year, we have several transcripts and recordings of daily cotton meetings at which these district and regional officials get daily reports on how the harvest is going, where they use incredibly, shockingly profane and abusive, threatening language to these officials to tell them to send their workers to the fields. And so that part of the system really hasn't changed this year, and is one of the key drivers of the forced labor system. So we see the directors of these institutions then putting pressure on their staff under threat of penalty to pick cotton or to pay for a replacement worker. And in the case of businesses, it's often the tax authorities and other law enforcement authorities that directly extort businesses to send staff or to make payments to buy replacement workers, again, under the threat that their business will be closed down or that they'll face burdensome inspections and fines.
Allison, this is Patricia. Sorry, I'm going to jump in here only because we're starting to get a bit short on time. And there are two questions that have come up. One is if there's an understanding of where the cotton from Uzbekistan goes, if you're familiar with, that flow. And another one, and if you could be brief in these answers, that would be great, is, what do you think it's going to take to change the system so that there isn't this need to constantly force workers to the fields?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. So the cotton produced in Uzbekistan is usually sold to traders, amalgamated with other cotton and sent to spinners, where it's made into yarn and fabric and then sold, for production. Much of it we think goes probably to Bangladesh, to China, some to Russia and Pakistan, but it's notoriously difficult to trace. Just one other development of this year is that the government has now publicly committed to doing more in-country processing of raw cotton. They're trying to move away from exporting raw cotton, but that so far is a work in progress. On the second question, I think one thing it's going to take is working from a shared set of facts about what is happening on the ground, so that all of us can make policy proposals that address the root causes of forced labor. That's why we're so committed to independent monitoring, so that we can actually try to figure out what the situation is, what's driving the system, and then making recommendations to address it. So in our case, we're really focusing on what we see as the root causes of forced labor.
Great, thanks, Allison. I'm going to go ahead and take the screen back, and you should be seeing my screen now. So in the last 15 minutes here, I'd like to go over what has the evolution of cotton pledges, and I'm talking about plural pledges because we have started pledge against Turkmen cotton harvested with forced labor, and there has also been an update to the Uzbek Pledge. We actually have over 200, I think we're at 276 brands and companies that have now signed the Uzbek Cotton Pledge. Due to, well, first of all, because we are now talking about two different pledges. We're not just talking about the Cotton Pledge, but the Uzbek Cotton Pledge. And we also switched the pledge in regards to the edits to cotton production. I know that weeding was mentioned earlier, planting as well as harvesting. So in the past, we maybe used terminology more specific to the harvest, but it's not just the harvest where the forced labor is being observed, and so that's why we switched it to production. In addition to that, I'll go ahead and let Kirill speak a bit more about the other change that we are proposing in regards to the ILO being the verification mechanism to having it be independent third-party monitors. And the Cotton Campaign has also listed out quite extensively changes that they're looking to see on the ground, which can be found on the Cotton Campaign website. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kirill just to speak a bit more about the difference between having the ILO verify no forced labor in the fields versus independent third-party monitors.
Thank you, Patricia. Well, it's very important to look at different reporting on the ground in Uzbekistan. The ILO reporting is also helpful in to look at their estimates. The reason why we're changing the language, and it's a minor change, but it's important that we can walk you through this decision-making process. Well, when we spoke to the ILO, they said that we are not a certification agency or a verification organization. We were not able to verify independently and put our stamp of approval. And we are in touch with the ILO and met with Director General Guy Ryder recently, 3 weeks ago. And we are looking closely at their monitoring effort, and not just that on the ground in Uzbekistan, but at the same time, the Cotton Campaign is a multi-stakeholder coalition, as you know, with business associations, responsible investors, brands, trade unions, human rights organizations, labor organizations, all united to look at this problem cohesively in both Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. But since we're talking about Uzbek Cotton Pledge, so we're able to look at this problem from many different perspectives. We are in charge. We're also in touch with frontline organizations who do the monitoring, the independent monitoring on the ground. And it's important that we are able to provide this information that we find on the ground in Uzbekistan and able to verify the progress that is being made in the cotton industry of Uzbekistan. We have heard that there were messages coming from the Uzbek government, some sent directly to the brands, saying that there is no longer a forced labor and child labor. We stated that multiple times that it's too soon to declare any victories. The Cotton Pledge on Uzbekistan was and is highly instrumental in bringing the positive change on the ground in Uzbekistan, and that was manifested by a significant reduction of child labor, which, as Alison mentioned, is phased out now. And we hope that with this additional encouragement and pressure, we will be able to use this opening in the country and this opportunity, this historic opportunity after 25 years essentially of authoritarian leadership there, with the new administration hopefully bring that necessary change in the cotton production. So with changing this to Cotton Campaign, we hope that our multi-stakeholder organization that has a decade history of work is able to verify if progress on the ground is sustainable, tangible, if it's real, and reported to the brands, to the international community, to the governments, and see when we can actually come to that point when we're able to say that this is no longer state organized, or not to the same scale, not to the same volume, and then see how gradually we're able to lift the pledge, lift the ban, and hopefully we're looking at this at the beginning of this process. At least we're hopeful. But for now, it's important that we maintain the pledge and that we are able to provide recommendation and verification as a multi-stakeholder coalition.
Great, thank you, Kirill. And I'm just trying to, there we go, introduce you all to the Turkmen Cotton Pledge, which is quite similar to the Uzbek Cotton Pledge. As you could see, it already focuses on Turkmenistan's cotton production, as well as having third-party monitors verify that the systemic organization of mass mobilization of people is no longer happening in the cotton fields. That pledge can also be found on the Responsible Sourcing Network website. It's the same link as where the original or Uzbek Cotton Pledge was found, only now you'll see two buttons, one for the Uzbek Cotton Pledge, one for the Turkmen Cotton Pledge. We are collecting signatories for this independently of the Uzbek Cotton Pledge, so if there's changes in one country or the other, to the point that we're ready to stop the pledge, we will. And we also didn't want to just assume everyone and all the companies who have signed the Uzbek Cotton Pledge would sign the Turkmen Cotton Pledge. We are trying to make it a little easier for you all. We uploaded a PDF that can be filled out and signed, and there's a link to a Dropbox account that could be dropped into, and therefore not doing it via email. However, email is also okay, but trying to make it a little more easy to add your company's name to that signatory list. We're still also collecting, if you haven't signed it in the past, a logo agreement, if you're willing to let us use your logo just in a slide deck or in other public fora where we talk about the companies that have signed the Turkmen Pledge. With the last few minutes here, I just want to mention the new initiative that Responsible Sourcing Network is now developing, which is called YES, Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced, which is takes after the conflict-free smelter program and setting up a due diligence program for yarn spinning mills to be able to have that assurance that they are not using cotton that has been harvested with forced labor or produced with forced labor. It does follow the guidance from the OECD for garment and footwear and responsible supply chains. It has a risk-based analysis, so it's basically expecting the spinners to have additional assurance for cotton coming from high-risk countries, to determine which ones are high risk or low risk. For the moment, we're referencing the U.S. Department of List of Goods produced with forced and child labor, looking at that list for forced labor. There's 9 countries on there, and developing the audit standard, trainings, checklists, etc. My colleague Liz Muller and I visited a number of spinners the last several months, and we're in the process now of developing the standard for distribution and public comment. Since I don't have a lot of time to go over the YES program today, there is a link to an hour-long webinar that Liz and I did for Textile Exchange last month, and that is on the RSN website. One thing I do want to point out are the differences between what is in scope and what's out of scope for the YES standard. So the standard itself are the specific expectations for the yarn spinner. And what we're looking at is a due diligence approach of materials management. So it's only looking at how the spinner is managing the cotton, the raw cotton that is coming through the doors, using a mass balance system of all the cotton that's received or processed at the facility. And it is set up for spinners to pass that audit or not pass that audit if they have additional requirements that they need to meet. What it is not looking at are labor conditions inside the mill, or even a standard to look at labor conditions in the field. That's not it. It's a standard for the spinner to be implementing management systems and a due diligence process for the management of their cotton sourcing. And that's all it is looking at the moment. We've done a lot of work already, and as I mentioned, we plan on circulating the standard, looking for that public feedback. So we're planning on sending that out early March, and it will be open for about 6 weeks to give us comment on the standard. So very much looking for all of your support and input as to how that is all progressing. Then later this year, after we integrate the various comments from the public comment period, then we will be preparing training materials and piloting the standard at probably just 3 or 4 spinning mills in September, October of this year. We do have a statement of support. You can see which brands and other stakeholders have supported just the overall general concept of yes, as well as we are soliciting additional members to join the working group. And part of being part of that working group would be to be able to nominate or recommend spinning mills for the project. We do have all the websites of the various organizations that had representatives speaking today. I know we're at the end of our hour. Again, I want to apologize for the technical difficulties today, but if there are any questions that you have that didn't get answered, then we would be happy to follow up with those via email. So feel free to get in touch or contact us all directly for any additional questions that you may have. So I want to thank everybody for your attention, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.